My name is Andrew Lacey. I'm a sculptor and I usually work in bronze. And the thing that I do along with that is a lot of historical reconstruction for museums. And so this is why I was invited to make this box for Poussin. The reason for making the box is because Poussin used to try to make the composition as a little stage set first, and then make the drawings, and then scale it up to a kind of intermediate size, get that right, and then scale it up again to a life-size thing using human models, get that perfect to make the paintings. So this box is really the first stage to get the composition, the idea of light, the form, and how the fabric falls over the figures. So it's a really great invention, really, because you can try out lots and lots of different ideas. You can change the lighting, you can change the figures, you can stand them anywhere, and play, really just play with the idea of what the form's going to be like, what the painting's going to be like, without having to commit to lots and lots and lots of drawings and preliminary sketches. So this is the machine, really, which makes everything else happen afterwards. So the box is made out of sweet chestnut, beautiful wood. On the outside, it really just looks like a chest. It's literally just a simple linen chest. There's an eye hole at one end, just about 2/3 up, and then there's 2 sliding doors on either side with brass plates over them, and then one on the rooftop as well. So that acts as the lighting, the kind of stage lighting, left, right, and above. And so if you put candles or allowed the sunlight to come in, you could create any sort of ambient lighting that you wanted in there. And then that would just sit literally onto a table, so whatever the table was. Inside is the board, this simple kind of stage set, which is about as large as half of the floor area of the box. And that's dead square and has loads of little holes on it, and the representation of the tiles that you see in the painting are actually grooved into the top of that box to act as a grid reference. Onto that, there's all the figures, all modelled in wax. The way of investigating this, even though there's lots and lots that's been written about it, there's only a few instances of people actually visiting the studio at the time and then recalling or writing down what they saw. So the way of perhaps reinventing this machine was to look at the painting as the primary source. And what would you need? What do you see in the painting that actually describes the necessity of the machine? So, for instance, the floor is one of the good things. It's a tiled floor. It's a stone floor with crisscrossing pattern. But it makes so much sense because you can see that it's, one, a stage set, because you see the front edge of the stone slabs. And also this grid reference that you get means that you can place all the figures time and time again, or in different positions, and keep referencing them. Then there's things like the size and dimension of the room that they're in. It all fits again and again. And so we try to extrapolate from the painting into what would be a real box. And then the other thing was just the practicalities. How big a box can you make? What's the method of making such a thing at that time? So it would have been single panels of wood, dovetail joints at the corners. And in looking at that, there was a really good friend of ours, Robin Williams, who constructed the box. So we worked together to figure out what the box might look like. And one of his ideas that came up is that it's really lovely that artists tend to be magpies. So they will find things, rather than commissioning someone else to make something for them, they'll find things very immediate. So things like a marriage chest, the linen box. It's perfect. It's exactly the right scale and size. It's something that they would have had at that time. And all the sides are dovetailed together, but the bottom of the box is just nailed on. So if you knock that out, you've got the lid at the top, which is exactly the same as ours, and then just put 2 doors at the sides for lighting and an eye hole, you get the exact same thing. And all the proportions, if you work backwards from the painting to the size of the figures, which are these half palm figures, all mean that the box that you'd need to house those happens to be about the same size as a linen chest. And then in the painting, we see the wife who's sitting at the end of the bed is on a linen chest, weeping away. So the whole thing linked together beautifully.
I'm Shawn Lewis. I'm an artist, and I work in various media, including bronze sculpture, photographic image and video. I assisted Andrew on this project. I worked very much with the fabric, the use of silk as clothing for the models. What was fantastic was exploring how to recreate the look of the fabrics on the models, and we used silk dupion, various colours, and the quality. They were so light reflective, such beautiful fabric. The colours were fantastic, and I also experimented with tea to create different sort of shades, really. And that was quite interesting. But the fascinating thing with the silk for me was the natural thing to do was to wet it, because of course it was quite sort of stiff really to start off with. So I wet it and applied it to the models, and as it was drying, I could manipulate the folds into the right place, pin them very lightly, and as the silk dried, it would hold in place. Then, of course, as it dried, it became more light reflective. There's a sort of liveliness to the using the silks, really, sort of painting with light kind of effect, really, isn't it?
Well, you see that lovely flow through the whole painting.
Yeah.
The contours and shapes, where the light hits all the folds. Oh, it's just wonderful against that silk.
Yeah.
And it comes to life then.
Yeah. So. I mean, from an artistic point of view, I'm so interested in light and colour anyway, and it was such a fantastic opportunity to explore the use of silk in that context, really.
But there were things which were really amazing where you'd have direct sunlight coming in.
Yeah.
And it was very strong, so it's almost too powerful, to be used. But then you get uplighting from the tabletop itself inside the box, which had this wonderful reflective kind of glow that would lift up their faces, or lift up the kind of the undersides of the robes and all the folds. And suddenly there's another level of manipulation and using nature to do this other thing and change these figures. And it was, in a way, it's kind of proving how many variations and how useful a tool it is to create all these different atmospheres, or not just the composition, but the atmosphere inside.
It's a great tool to be able to control light in a space to create a dramatic effect, really, because it's totally controllable.
All of the figures are made out of beeswax. But it wasn't the pure refined beeswax that you get nowadays. It's just literally the first draining of beeswax that you get. It's full of rubbish and dirt and all sorts of insect detritus, and which is good because it makes a kind of depth to it in terms of colour. But also there was pine resin, which gets mixed in with it. There's about 25% pine resin, and it makes it just slightly stiffer and more plastic to work with. So when you've modelled up these little figures, and they're so tiny and they're quite delicate, but with the slightest bit of warmth from your hand, they actually become really malleable. And so the idea of Poussin having quite a lot of figures, we know how good and skilled he is as a sculptor. If you have a lot of these figures around, maybe it's like different sizes, male and female, you can quite easily introduce new characters in, warm them up in your hands, manipulate them, put them into a kind of good characteristic form, good shape, and then try them out. And so the trial and error process of modelling and trying new compositions is very quick, but it only really works well with that sort of slightly plastic beeswax, which was gorgeous to work with. It also smells fantastic. Just want to eat it all the time. The thing is, as much as you try and think and kind of intellectualise how things are used, until you actually use them, it doesn't really mean that much. And then when you do start to use it, very quickly it informs you everything about how it needs to be used and operated. And there's so many nice little parallels between what we've heard from Poussin.
Yeah. And until you're met with the challenge of trying to reproduce the scene, it's all a bit, it is academic, and the solutions present themselves very naturally, I think.
And there was a lovely thing that's described Poussin using a stick to manipulate the cloth inside. And I was thinking, is that right? You know, why would you use a stick when you can just take the top off and you can start moving the figures around yourself? And then there was one moment where I'm looking through the eye hole and I needed to change the drapery. So I got a screwdriver, long screwdriver, and started pushing through the side.
That's why,
This is why. This is how, because you need to be able to look at it and observe it and move it all at the same time. And it's like, yeah, okay, that gets us closest to his thinking. It's
but it's in the doing,
practice.
it's in the creating of the whole thing. It's like forensically going back to giving you much more information than you sort of read about.
But when it works perfectly, is even on an overcast day, is when you have it near a window. And so if the windows on one side of the building obviously is going to be better lit than the other, maybe south facing, east facing, whatever, but there's going to be one side that you're going to be predominantly drawn to because you're a painter, and so you want to use that available light. If you use the box next to that, then suddenly you get this beautiful raking light, which reminded me then, and we've seen this, we've witnessed this in our own studio, where we have a studio which is about 50 foot long, 20 foot wide, and very, very high, but it has two large double doors either side and works in exactly the same way. So a lot of the pre-thinking about how one might use the studio space and also use the box came from just observations in our barn studio, where we'd have a very large sculpture at one end, which we always use like a kind of theatre stage because it's an empty space which we can take photographs from. And the best way to get some of the most beautiful light was to open up one side of the doors. And you get this dramatic raking light coming across, illuminating the large plaster structure or whatever in front of you. And so there were lots of links, but it does make you think of the box and its greater context in the studio and how light may be used in the studio, both on the small scale and the big scale.
So when we were then setting up the figures on the platform, introducing them onto the board one by one, that then presented a natural idea for video to set up introducing the figures one after the other, really, to build up the scene, rather like a psychodrama.
That was one of the fun things, is actually deciding who's important and who's less important in the image, and then progressively taking away those figures.
Yeah.
And then you end up with quite a profound scene at the end, which was beautiful, with just the man in the bed. And it was quite emotional.
And the dynamics between the figures became more potent, as it were, really, as the figures got less and less. Well, in a different way to when the whole crowd is there. As it got less and less, it became, I don't know, very poignant.